request the speakers to be a little bit louder because it's hard to hear at the back and you don't have a mic. So if you think you're a little louder for this part of the room, then you're probably just trying to that.
I'm a professor. I like to talk loudly. Well, thank you. Is this middle button laser?
Presumably.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm not really in video these days, but I am in analytics and I am doing imaging. So what I'll be talking about is kind of an arc of things I've been doing, and some of this leads up to this predictive policing thing that we're doing today. So the focus of my talk is going to be how we've used machine learning in the field of medical imaging, so medical diagnosis and so forth. I'd like to thank Motorola not only for sponsoring this, but for endowing funding the Endowed chair that supports our work. So what's the common thread here of medical imaging, machine learning, and predictive analytics? It's that we're talking about analytics problems where the data are intrinsically spatiotemporal or graphical, so like a social network, for example. And so that's a little bit different from your sort of classic data mining where you'll have table data to start with and you start number crunching right away. For us, we have a lot of pre-processing issues. We need to turn our image data or spatiotemporal or graphical data into some kind of measurable statistical attributes. So now I'm going to go way back in history. This is the sort of thing I did when I was a graduate student in the 1980s. So I was a fellow of the Army Research Office, and the Reagan Star Wars program was in full swing, and we were being paid to look at military target recognition. So specifically, I was tasked to look at, could you recognize things from night vision imagery? So things were a little bit early then, so I had to build my own photon counting camera. It would collect individual light photons and display them on a phosphor screen and digitize all of this information as it came. And this is an example of what the images look like. So each dot you see there is one light photon. And the trick there was to see, is there something in the scene? And so an algorithm would conclude that there's something suspicious there. And then if you look at the actual image, it was a very sort of rudimentary representation of a tank in the scene. So things were a little bit primitive, but we were doing some kind of neat things. But the tools were really backwards back then. And I did this work on a DEC PDP-11 computer that had 64K of memory. So we couldn't save the image and the code in memory at the same time. So that created all sorts of silly practical problems. In those days, as I say, the algorithms weren't that good. So I worked up an early version of the method that's now called the support vector machine back in about 1989. Well, after that, I left the field of machine learning for quite some time, and I focused more on image processing and medical imaging. And Aguilos, one of the speakers, I wrote a book chapter together with a friend. And so that's what I was doing there for quite some time. But I started to realize as I got steeped in medical imaging that it was really crying out for decision support and the use of the sort of things that I was doing when I was a student back in the 80s. So the first thing we did was to develop an algorithm which would automatically analyze mammograms. So just like we found the tank in that scene, we would find abnormalities in a patient's breast image. And there we use support vector machines and relevance vector machines, so some of these machine learning tools. We then built around that, once we were able to automatically analyze the images and measure things from them, we built a search engine, which was a content-based retrieval system, which would recall clinically relevant mammograms from a database. And it used a similarity concept that was actually learned from radiologists, so it wasn't just simply a math technique. We created a method of imaging prostate cancer. Previously, there were no ways to image prostate cancer. I really should say that you can make images, and there have been many efforts to make images, but the difficulty is that when you make, for example, MRI images of various kinds, it's very hard to interpret what you're seeing, and so we proposed an algorithm by which you could synthesize this information using machine learning into an image where the colored blobs indicate the locations of tumors. This movie isn't working. This was the one video in my presentation, so I apologize for that. We have been doing cardiac imaging, so heart imaging for heart patients. And the method there starts way back at raw data. So you get data from a medical imaging scanner. You then reconstruct that data into a four-dimensional representation of the heart. So it's a 3D image, and the heart would be beating if this movie was working. So there's a mesh model of the heart. From that, we digest some time information. We turn that into your basic sort of features, statistical attributes. And from that, we apply a classifier and represent that in a way that's visual for a clinician. This is a slice through the heart, and the dark area indicates that the algorithm believes this is a diseased area, so it shows it as incomplete. So that's a snapshot of some of the things that we do at the Illinois Institute of Technology in our academic research. Let me back up again to the year 2001, around that time that I started applying machine learning in medical imaging. I started a little company called Predictive, and there what we were doing was using brain scans to provide data analytics services to the pharmaceutical industry. And so the problem there is when drug companies are developing a new compound, the only way to tell if it's really working in the brain is to give it to a lot of people and wait and see if it works, right? But imaging is now playing a major role in this. And what you do is you take functional images of the brain and figure out which parts are being affected by the drug. And you can do this in a very small number of research subjects. And so the model here is that the drug company commissions the study. Usually a major university hospital gathers the images. They come to us, and we explain what does it all mean. So we analyze many drugs by this approach. It gets really complicated procedurally because now you're synthesizing all this imaging stuff and all the machine learning stuff that we know, all the modeling, all the bootstrapping, and all of this stuff. But all of this has to be carefully controlled for FDA audit purposes. They need to be able to have a trail so that they know exactly when a patient comes in what was done to the information that goes into the FDA approval. And so we built software which would draw a flow chart of what's done, save it all in real time in a version control repository, and provide this audit record. Well, in the old days of when we started out, antidepressants and things like this were all the rage. Lately, the industry is really focused on Alzheimer's disease and other aging diseases, dementias. And so one of the big things driving this is that there are new drugs coming coming on the horizon, but the drugs have been failing in clinical trials. And that's caused a great deal of disappointment, a lot of loss of investment. And part of the reason for all this is that many of the patients enrolled in these studies don't actually even have Alzheimer's disease. We don't have a reliable way to know when someone's forgetful and all these other symptoms. Is that really Alzheimer's? You can't know for sure until they've died and you do a post-mortem. So the goal here is to use imaging to tell us, is this a fair person to be putting into a trial? So we're working with Janssen Alzheimer's Immunotherapy, a company that's an affiliate of Johnson & Johnson. We've developed a machine learning algorithm that automatically detects Alzheimer's disease, stages the disease, or tells you whether it's one of these other diseases. So these are brain patterns that are typical of these various diseases that could be confused for Alzheimer's. So the algorithm detects that these blue areas are these blue areas are the ones that begin to deteriorate as the disease comes on. These areas, the neurons stop functioning properly, and it basically starts shutting down. So our algorithms, using this and other information, are able to get 95+% accuracy in discriminating the various conditions, which is quite high, much higher than you can do visually, even an expert radiologist can do. And we're also able to tell you, using the output of a classifier plotted on this scale, how a person progresses from normal up through Alzheimer's disease. And we can even, in some cases, tell that a person has the disease even before they're showing any of the outward symptoms at all. So there's a lot of promise here for this and a lot of importance for drug use. So this leads me into the predictive policing. So against this backdrop, I began working with Jonathan Lewin, commander from the Chicago Police Department, on a project to see whether some of these data analytic methods, imaging methods, and so forth could be applied in the field of crime analysis and crime prediction. So we were initially inspired to do this because the National Institute of Justice, a part of the Justice Department, put out a challenge asking city municipal police departments to work with academics, industry partners to come up with ideas. And so we competed to put out concepts and some initial results of what could you do. And Chicago Police Department, my university, IIT, won that competition. We got a $3 million grant, as Jonathan mentioned, and that began just this year. So we're really just getting started in earnest here. So let me just tell you the concept of the thing. One of the goals is to create predictive maps. So these look a little bit like those brain imaging maps, right? So the red areas are areas the algorithm would think are likely to see an uptick in crime in the next 24 to 72 hours. Now this is just a mock-up. We haven't created the software yet. We've just presented how we hope to approach it, but this is the kind of goal we hope. So borrowing from imaging, I talked about mesh modeling of the heart. We're mesh modeling the city of Chicago, trying to focus our algorithm more finely, make finer scale predictions in areas of the city where there's plenty of data to support that historically. So our learning algorithms really have enough information to work with. In other areas like Lake Michigan, we really can't make meaningful predictions there. There's just no data about it. So Jonathan mentioned social network analysis. So CPD now has social network capabilities where people can go in and understand relationships among offenders, but we're building prediction models on top of those in order to provide more full information that human analysts may not be able to consume. So medical imaging and crime prediction are both timely, that's obvious, and what's been fun for me is bringing things that from the more mature imaging field, where there's been a lot of money poured in over the past few decades, into the field of crime prediction, which is a much newer field, where there's a lot of exciting things. Oh, thank you very much.
Dr. Wernick, I'd like to invite Dr. Katsagalos from Northwestern University